The United States is often called a Christian country. The nation, however, has always been home to individuals indifferent to, or opposed to, organized religions. These unbelievers were known as agnostics, atheists, deists, infidels, liberals, and freethinkers.
The golden age of free thought unfolded at a time of unprecedented social and cultural ferment. In the post-Civil War years, immigration increased dramatically. We had whole new ethnic groups. We had a very significant Roman Catholic population coming into the northeastern cities at about this time. You had just hordes and hordes of people moving west, opening up new areas of the country, people from vastly different walks of life, rubbing shoulders with each other, spinning off new social movements, new religions, a time of great technological advance.
Since the founding of the United States, Protestantism had been the dominant form of Christianity in America. Near the end of the 19th century, however, freethinkers faced another formidable foe, Roman Catholicism. Although Catholics represented only a minority of the American population, the Roman Catholic Church was fast becoming the nation's most powerful Christian denomination. With increasing political savvy, the Catholic Church hierarchy brought to bear its growing power against modernism and in favor of censorship. Pope Leo's attacks on science, along with his attempt to control the Catholic vote and reign over American public schools, were seen by freethinkers as a broad assault on the U.S. Constitution. The truth seeker challenged Roman Catholicism and the increasing influence of fundamentalism, both bent on turning back the clock on the modern age. By the 1880s, the Truth Seeker was the most widely read free thought periodical in the world. With renowned rationalist writers, thousands of loyal supporters, the publication was practically an organization in itself and the flagship of the American free thought movement. One segment of society, however, remained absent from the free thought movement. In the late 19th century, many freed African Americans were less likely than members of other groups to abandon Christianity and join free thinkers in their fight for secularism. During the decades after emancipation, former slaves had existential concerns more pressing than separation of church and state, the theory of evolution, or censorship. There were, however, Black Americans associated with the free thought movement, most notably abolitionist Frederick Douglass.
He certainly left behind comments very critical of the churches, and of course there was his famous line about how when he was a slave he prayed for freedom, but his prayers were never answered until he prayed with his feet. Douglass was a little cagey in how he talked about it, but yes, I think he probably was a freethinker.
The deep and lasting friendship between Frederick Douglass and his fellow orator Robert Ingersoll was perhaps the most important association in America between a famous freethinker and a prominent former slave.
It went back to Ingersoll's years in Peoria when Douglass had come to town and needed a place to stay, and Ingersoll opened his home to him. Now, this was very unusual for a wealthy white man to invite a black traveler, even however distinguished, to share his home.
In 1883, after civil rights legislation made it through Congress, only to be struck down by the Supreme Court, Robert Ingersoll spoke at a mass meeting to protest the decision and press for civil rights legislation.
Frederick Douglass was the chair of that meeting, and Douglass introduced the evening's keynote speaker, who was Robert Ingersoll. who gave, we think extemporaneously, what became one of his standard speeches on civil rights. So this was a significant moment in the movement for civil rights, and Douglass and Ingersoll were right there making it happen.
While freethinkers remained united in their opposition to institutionalized religion, there was a broad divergence of opinions regarding economic, political, and social issues. Therefore, the National Liberal League confined its energies to the 9 demands of liberalism. In 1884, the Liberal League elected truth-seeker editor Eugene MacDonald as president and changed its name to the American Secular Union.
Not because the name has acquired ugly connotations, but because there have started to be liberal religious movements, such as the Unitarians, and the term liberal is now a little bit too much connected to religion.
When it came to politics, freethinkers were never a monolithic group. As editor of Freethought's Journal of Record, Eugene MacDonald had to tread lightly around politics. A letter, printed in the weekly by Robert Ingersoll, explaining his Republican opinion on political matters, could cause readers to cancel their subscriptions. MacDonald avoided anarchism, populism, and socialism, which, like most freethinkers, he regarded as another faith-based religion. The truth seeker, however, attacked monopoly capitalists and supported labor reform and workers' rights. And while it never agreed with violent political extremists, in 1886, it came to the defense of anarchists. The Haymarket tragedy was the climax of a decade of agitation and strikes. During a peaceful gathering of striking workers near Chicago's Haymarket Square, a bomb was thrown, killing civilians and policemen. The bomb thrower was never apprehended. The social revolutionaries, or anarchists, who organized the protest, however, were arrested and prosecuted. Their trial was one of the most unfair in the annals of American jurisprudence. The Haymarket affair attracted widespread newspaper coverage and ignited antagonism towards anarchists and freethinkers, dividing the country and creating the first Red Scare. Many prominent freethinkers supported the imprisoned anarchists. Robert Ingersoll privately offered to serve as co-counsel for the defendants. He was, however, concerned that his reputation as the country's most conspicuous unbeliever would hurt the case, especially given the clergy's repeated conflation of anarchism and atheism in the press. George Francis Train, the eccentric shipping magnate who had supported D.M. Bennett's fight for free speech, visited the defendants in jail. One of the anarchists committed suicide. 4 were hanged. Others were imprisoned, but with Clarence Darrow's assistance, eventually pardoned. Perhaps the Freethought activist most influenced by the Haymarket tragedy was Voltairine de Cleyre. This feminist author devoted the rest of her life to anarchism and arranged to be buried near the graves and monument of the martyred anarchists after she died in 1912. Although it would take another 2 decades of struggle before women could vote, free-thinking females were making their mark in other areas. In the last decade of the 19th century, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the main contributor to the Woman's Bible, which condemned Christianity for its role in the subjugation of women. Also contributing to this book, which clergy denounced as the work of Satan, was Stanton's feminist colleague, Matilda JOSLYN Gage.
She was very critical of the growing influence of evangelicalism, Protestant Christianity in the late 19th century women's rights movement, especially through organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And so she explicitly spoke out against women's rights activists explicitly adopting or affiliating themselves with a particular religious organization or religious belief. Probably her most famous work is Woman, Church, and State, which was published in 1893. And it was a criticism of the negative influence of organized religion on women's status.
In late 19th century America, puritanical blasphemy laws were still on the books in many municipalities across the country.
They weren't used terribly often. A blasphemy prosecution was a fairly rare thing, but the threat was always there. And that threat was often used to put limits on what freethinkers could say or how they could say it.
In 1886, Charles B. Reynolds, a former preacher turned liberal orator, planned a summer of traveling Freethought lectures.
Reynolds raised some money, built a tent, and went around the country doing outdoor tent revivals for Freethought. The first person to do that occasioned a good deal of popular outrage. At one of his revivals in New Jersey, an angry mob burned down his tent.
In the fall of 1886, Charles Reynolds was indicted on blasphemy charges in New Jersey. During his trial in May 1887, Reynolds was defended in the Morristown courtroom by attorney Robert Ingersoll. The great agnostic's arrival in Morristown was the biggest thing to hit that part of New Jersey in years, and widely covered by the press.
Ingersoll never called a single witness. Basically, the entire burden of his defense of Charles B. Reynolds took the form of a lengthy and very eloquent summation. Reynolds was convicted of blasphemy, ordered to pay a fine. Ingersoll paid the fine out of his pocket.
In the late 19th century, the conflict between Christian fundamentalism and modernism was not confined to conservative municipalities. In 1888, the editor of The Truth Seeker learned firsthand of the powerful alliance between church and state when he was denied the right to vote in New York City because of his refusal to swear on the Bible. In the 1880s, the world's freethinkers adopted Italian philosopher Giordano Bruno as one of their martyrs. A victim of the Inquisition, Bruno was burned at the stake in 1600 for his heretical views. In an effort to honor Bruno, freethinkers mounted a campaign, spearheaded in America by the Truth Seeker, to have a monument built in Rome near the Vatican. The campaign succeeded, and in 1889, the Giordano Bruno Monument was unveiled amidst frantic protest by the Roman Catholic Church. The Vatican opposed any monument honoring Bruno, especially one erected on the spot where the Freethought martyr had been burned. Pope Leo called the effort a sacrilegious deed. Because they feared that Protestant public school teachers and students would diminish their faith, Catholics built their own parochial school system. Ironically, freethinkers and Protestants shared an opposition to any public funding of parochial schools. Nothing was sacred to the Truth Seeker, especially the holy relics and priestly pomp presented by the Catholic Church. Freethought's most irreverent cartoonist, Watson Heston, whose drawings were occasionally considered even too blasphemous for the Truth Seeker, tirelessly targeted Roman Catholicism. For several years, freethinkers fought for the repeal of restrictive, church-sponsored Sunday laws. In 1891, the Truth Seekers succeeded in winning a long, hard-fought campaign to secure the opening of New York's museums on the Sabbath, the only day many citizens had off from work.
Protestant fanatics wanted to cancel all mail service on the Sundays. They wanted ships and transportation to stop. This was a constant struggle to push back against this very well-organized force.
Freethinkers also fought against the Christian National Reform Association, which pressed for and very nearly succeeded in securing a Christian amendment to the Constitution in 1894.
There were repeated efforts during the Gilded Age on the part of Christian conservatives to introduce constitutional amendments, to put God in the Constitution, to put it in the Constitution that America exists under God or under the protection of God.
So it took courage to stand up as members of a very small minority, just a handful of individuals, really, against, well-organized opposition like that.
Ingersoll certainly played as much a role as any other single activist in helping to turn back those efforts.
Despite his continuous condemnation of Christianity in writing and on the lecture platform, Robert Ingersoll maintained an honored presence in mainstream American culture.
Ingersoll was a patron of the arts. He was a significant figure on the social scene in Washington, D.C., and later in New York City. Ingersoll had one foot in the Freethought movement and one foot in the corridors of power, as no one else in the movement did. He was Freethought's ambassador.
Thomas Edison, Mark Twain, and poet Walt Whitman were among Robert Ingersoll's friends.
Walt Whitman was also a great admirer of Ingersoll's and once wrote that I consider Ingersoll one of the constellations of our time. Ingersoll and Whitman were so close that when Whitman died, Ingersoll was chosen to deliver the eulogy. And he gave a tremendous memorial speech to Whitman that's one of his classic speeches.
Ingersoll was an exceptional attorney and sought-after political orator. Many believed Robert Ingersoll could have been the President of the United States.
Everyone who knew him, agree or disagree, felt very warmly about him. And he was supremely competent. He probably could have been elected president or at least been elected to some high office, the Senate or whatever it might be, if he'd been willing to make himself more popularly acceptable on the level of religion.
Robert Ingersoll was often attacked by Christians as being a godless infidel.
Ingersoll's morals, the quality of his family life were absolutely impeccable. In fact, Ingersoll's Christian opponents were always desperate to prove that Ingersoll showed some sign of being corrupted by the devil. And Ingersoll never gave them that pleasure.
On July 21, 1899, Robert Green Ingersoll died from a heart attack in Dobbs Ferry, New York. Ingersoll's death was reported along with lavish tributes in most American newspapers. Yet, as they had done after Thomas Paine's death in 1809, religionists claimed that the great agnostic had recanted on his deathbed.
Ingersoll never recanted on his deathbed. He died a proud freethinker as he had lived. Of course, that did not stop a huge number of Christian apologists from claiming falsely that Ingersoll had recanted, to the point that it became a frequent exercise for Ingersoll's daughters, his wife, his friends, people who had worked for the family at the time, were constantly going in and swearing affidavits that Ingersoll had never recanted and that he had died an agnostic.
For more than 3 decades, Robert Ingersoll was the spokesman and leading spirit of the American Freethought movement. Long after his death, the great agnostic was remembered by countless Americans who saw and heard him speak, or had only read about him. In 1901, another death and its repercussions caused consternation among freethinkers: the assassination of President McKinley. Shot by anarchist Leon Czolgosz during the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, ignited a national anti-anarchist hysteria. And as they had done 15 years earlier in the aftermath of the Haymarket tragedy, religious journals blamed atheism. A few weeks after the assassination, the American Secular Union held its annual convention. Eugene MacDonald was again elected president. In a public statement, the Secular Union responded to the absurd accusations. The assassin anarchist was not of our fraternity, but was born in the Orthodox Church and trained in its parochial schools, and will doubtless walk to the electric chair with a priest on either side of him. Another concern among free thinkers was President McKinley's successor, the Rough Rider, who, a few years earlier, called Thomas Paine a filthy little atheist. Between 1700 and 1900, tuberculosis caused an estimated 1 billion deaths worldwide. Tuberculosis, or consumption as it was commonly called, was dubbed the White Plague and seen as a romantic malady. Artists, poets, and musicians glorified the spirituality of the deadly disease. Young women paled their skin to achieve the popular consumptive look. In the early 20th century, an estimated 1 out of every 7 deaths in America was from tuberculosis. New York City's density, high population, and poor sanitary conditions provided the perfect environment for spreading the disease. Prior to the use of antibiotics, New Yorkers seeking a cure fled the city and traveled upstate to sanitariums in the Catskill Mountains. Thousands were treated at self-contained tuberculosis sanitariums. Some were known as waiting rooms for death. Loomis Sanitarium in Sullivan County, however, had a remarkable history of success with the disease compared to other institutions, and was about the only hope in the era before antibiotics. After learning that he had tuberculosis in 1908, truth-seeker editor Eugene MacDonald left his brother George in charge of the publication and departed Manhattan, which he called the city of magnificence and squalor, and moved to Sullivan County to take the cure. MacDonald spent the summer living in a tent, eating fresh eggs, milk, fruit, and vegetables, a diet that, along with the mountain air and sunshine, was believed to restore health. Eugene MacDonald was with The Truth Seeker for 35 years and its editor for a quarter of a century. MacDonald, whose hobby was sailing, masterfully steered The Truth Seeker through Freethought's golden age and into the 20th century. At the age of 54, Eugene MacDonald died in his wife's arms on February 26, 1909. It is fitting that the editor, who devoted his entire adult life promoting free thought and fighting for civil liberties, died in a village called Liberty. After Eugene's death in 1909, his brother George MacDonald became editor of The Truth Seeker, the only significant free thought publication left in America. That year marked the 100th anniversary of the birth of Charles Darwin and the death of Thomas Paine, two men whose revolutionary lives The Truth Seeker continued to champion. In 1913, Anthony Comstock bragged that he had driven 15 persons to suicide in his fight for the young. He also wrote, or took credit, for authoring 2 books.
In looking at Comstock's arrest records, he speaks in a vernacular language, a language of the streets. It's very colloquial, it's colorful, it's bold. In those books, he alternates between some speech that carries that voice and some more high-toned speech. My sense as a historian, when I look at those passages and compare them to the reports of the Society for the Suppression of Vice and the YMCA reports, is that those are passages he either lifted from those materials of more educated men or were ghostwritten by them.
Comstock claimed that he had convicted enough people to fill a passenger train of 61 coaches and destroyed 160 tons of what he determined was obscene literature.
We have a very odd picture of the late 19th century because a whole realm of printed materials, illustrations, words have been effectively erased.
By the early 20th century, the soldier of righteousness and self-described weeder in God's garden had become the subject of cartoons and ridicule.
Things that he did increasingly over time seemed laughable. Protesting a nude postcard sent by the Art Student League, that's pretty ridiculous, but his impact on individual lives was often very profound. And, you know, for 40 years, policed the borders of what was acceptable in this country. And I don't know whether it's true that 15 people killed themselves, but it gives you some feeling for how intense the battle was.
In the years leading up to America's entry into World War I, debates and editorials filled American newspapers, including The Truth Seeker. And while its editorial policy remained neutral on the question of America going to war, its columns provided an open forum.
There were large groups of Americans who weren't supportive of the war. There were German Americans who had emigrated, some of them very recently. They were first and second generation Germans who were clearly supportive of their fatherland. There were socialists who saw the war as simply a capitalist war and felt that they had much more in common with the working class in Germany and Austria than they did with the capitalists in America who were making profits from munitions.
The Truth Seeker consistently reported and denounced the religious rhetoric of political leaders who claimed to have God on their side, an editorial policy which some perceived as unpatriotic.
Because there were these deep divisions in the American people, the government exercised tremendous coercive force against people who criticized the war. There were more than 2,000 arrests under the Espionage Act and under the Sedition Act of people for making remarks about the war that were often as banal as, you know, Wilson is a blockhead, could get you sent to the penitentiary.
In 1915, a Roman Catholic organization introduced a bill in Congress aimed at the Truth Seeker. The law, which nearly passed, was a sweeping censorship bill disguised as a periodical mail regulation to exclude from the mails any paper that tended to expose any race, creed, or religion to hatred, contempt, ridicule, or abuse. Leading up to and during the war, the Truth Seeker relied on Thomas Paine's wisdom and often featured his writing. It was not alone. Even mainstream newspapers printed patriotic quotes by Robert Ingersoll, and especially Thomas Paine. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of his country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Thomas Paine. As they had done in the aftermath of the Haymarket tragedy and the McKinley assassination, religious leaders and politicians condemned free thought. Prominent priests and pastors publicly questioned the courage of atheists forced to serve their country and declared Darwin caused the war. This theory was initiated by Vernon Kellogg, a professor of entomology and influential author. After hearing German military officers discuss their social Darwinist philosophy, Kellogg abandoned his former pacifism and campaigned for America to enter the war.
He said the German high command often talked about how life was just a struggle, that violence was one of the ingredients in that survival of the fittest, and the Germans were going to win out in this great battle. That doesn't prove that Darwin had anything to do with World War I. Again, his name's being used in vain.
With both of his sons serving honorably in Europe, George MacDonald refused to let truth become a casualty of war. MacDonald exposed church graft and the unethical actions of the YMCA and the Salvation Army. After an associate editor of the publication took issue with an Illinois governor over a religious argument, the solicitor of the post office in Washington pronounced the truth seeker unmailable under the Espionage Act.
The post office suppressed a lot of publications on the slightest pretext of dissent from the government. So that was a major piece of the repression of the period. The sustained, organized fight for free speech doesn't begin until after World War I.
A new factor is introduced into the American political scene. Susan B. Anthony and her followers have won for women the right to vote.
Many of the liberal leaders of the women's rights movement had already passed away before women won the right to vote in 1920. Other progressive initiatives that they had fought for, however, were still being rigidly opposed by Christian conservatives. During the second decade of the 20th century, an anti-secularist crusade began that would continue into the 1920s. Religious conservatives, including Roman Catholics, feared modernist ideas which had been popularized during the golden age of free thought. Fundamentalists bent on reviving old-time religion mounted a counterattack on what many called atheistic communism. The explosion of protest and strikes following World War I, which caused deep anxiety among Americans, frightened Christian conservatives who blamed the unholy alliance of freethinkers, political anarchists, evolutionists, and socialists.
It precipitated a lot of deep anxiety. The economy was bad. There were a lot of people out of work. That concern that the country might be subject to revolutionary overthrow.
In 1919, President Wilson appointed former Congressman A. Mitchell Palmer, who called himself the Fighting Quaker, as Attorney General.
He hoped that he would be the Democratic nominee for president. And I think Fighting Quaker is you need some term like that, some handle like that to help your campaign.
After civil unrest, bomb threats, and explosions, which terrified the public, Palmer launched a series of controversial raids on suspected radicals.
Palmer, with the assistance of a very young J. Edgar Hoover, organized a series of raids throughout the country that arrested more than 4,000, mostly immigrant, mostly Russian, members of various parties that had pledged themselves at one time or another to revolution.
Not all anarchists advocated violent revolution, but it was difficult, for some, to tell the difference between philosophical and violent anarchism. Russian-born atheist and political activist Emma Goldman was deported along with other immigrants.
It was hard for the country to see any distinction. We had Emma Goldman, who in fact was a famous advocate of free speech, but also an unrepentant anarchist. And her lover, of course, was convicted of trying to kill a Pittsburgh industrialist. And even Emma, on occasion, had some pretty violent language. It was hard for people to see anarchism as a philosophy. So it was this Red Scare, basically this American panic attack, that was the immediate backdrop for the founding of the American Civil Liberties Union.
Some viewed A. Mitchell Palmer's paranoia, disregard for free speech, and unreasonable search and seizure as reminiscent of Anthony Comstock's crusade. In 1920, freedom of speech advocates founded the American Civil Liberties Union, an organization similar to the National Defense Association, established 4 decades earlier in the office of the truth seeker. Future Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, a co-founder of the ACLU, spent the early 1920s campaigning for fairer treatment of anarchists and labor radicals.
People's lives had been broken. A lot of people, never recovered from imprisonment under the Espionage and the Sedition Act, and prompted these people to say to themselves, this is not what the country is about. If we can't debate something as basic as war and peace, we can't claim to be a democracy. Something has to be done to create additional protections for free speech. And the ACLU, their initial approach was to launch a campaign, really a public relations campaign, on behalf of civil liberties and free speech.
In 1925, the Butler Act, a law prohibiting the teaching of evolution in public schools, passed in Tennessee.
The reaction of the fundamentalists in this country, the effort to introduce religion into the schools, was a pushback against the increasingly scientific teaching in the schools.
Former Secretary of State and three-time presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan was instrumental in getting laws passed against teaching evolution in schools.
He was an amazing figure who astounded the political establishment in 1896 with a great speech, Cross of Gold speech, that attempted to rally the progressive forces of the country against the bosses and the millionaires and the capitalists, who were pretty much, as he said, running roughshod over the country at the time.
William Jennings Bryan sought to rally progressives, but his religious views were less advanced than his politics.
William Jennings Bryan had campaigned for a number of years to get laws passed by various state legislatures to require the teaching of evolution as an hypothesis. He didn't actually want to stop the teaching of evolution, but he wanted it to be taught as an hypothesis that was not fully proven.
He wasn't alone. There were others who were pushing legislatures increasingly to introduce religion into the schools. Prayer in the schools was being adopted in the 1920s by a number of states, and the battle against evolution, the teaching of evolution, was part of that effort to Christianize the schools.
William Jennings Bryan, however, had also read Headquarters Nights and was influenced by Vernon Kellogg's conjecture about social Darwinism.
His main concern was about social Darwinism, which should not be blamed on Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin was not a social Darwinist. They were arguing that rich people had their money because they were the survival of the fittest. He was also concerned by certain German statements about how they belonged to a superior race, even in the early 20th century and during World War I.
Soon after the Butler Act passed, prohibiting the teaching of evolution, the ACLU decided to challenge the constitutionality of the law and began an active search for a teacher to serve as a defendant. John T. Scopes, a high school science teacher in Dayton, Tennessee, agreed to stand trial. Clarence Darrow was hired by the ACLU to defend Scopes.
Well, Clarence Darrow was the leading defense attorney in the country at the time. He was notorious because of his agnosticism and his willingness to attack established ideas.
William Jennings Bryan, a hero to Christian fundamentalists in the Bible Belt, argued for the prosecution.
Clarence Darrow's entry into the Scopes case made it a national event. And then Bryan joining the case for the other side almost immediately thereafter made it really truly the trial of the century.
The monkey trial, as it was dubbed by Baltimore Sun newspaper writer H.L. Mencken, was the first in America to be covered by broadcast media.
Darwin never said that human beings came from monkeys. What he did say was that human beings and the higher primates came from a common origin back millions and millions of years ago. And yet I think a lot of people still believe that Darwin said human beings came from monkeys. And Mencken didn't help by dubbing this the monkey trial. And it was a kind of a sensational atmosphere. People brought chimpanzees there, and there were little stuffed monkeys that were being sold in Dayton, Tennessee during the trial. So there was a sensational aspect about the whole thing.
It was an intellectual circus, sideshows and all. The monkey trial was played like a comedy. The Daytonian said, "We pay the taxes, let the schools teach what we believe." But the real issue of the trial was the right to teach whatever science had found to be true.
There were 200 newspaper reporters covering the Scopes trial and 2,500 newspapers carrying long excerpts from it. So it really was a dramatic turning point, I think, for free speech in this country.
The Honorable William Jennings Bryan, defender of the faith. For the defense and the infidels, Clarence Darrow.
The deeply religious judge who quoted scripture during the trial clashed with Clarence Darrow. During a spellbinding speech, reminiscent of Robert Ingersoll, whom he greatly admired, Darrow tried to persuade the judge and America that the anti-evolution law should be overturned. The fires have been lighted in America to kindle religious bigotry and hate, Darrow declared. If today you can take a thing like evolution and make it a crime to teach in the public schools, tomorrow you can make it a crime to teach it in the private schools. At the next session, you may ban books and newspapers. Soon you may set Catholic against Catholic and Protestant against Protestant and try to foist your own religion upon the minds of men. If you can do one, you can do the other. Ignorance and fanaticism are ever busy and need feeding. After a while, Your Honor, it is the setting of man against man and creed against creed, until with flying banners and beating drums we are marching backward to the glorious ages of the 16th century, when bigots lighted fires to burn the men who dared to bring any intelligence and enlightenment and culture to the human mind. Darrow's speech was praised by the national press. A cartoon in the Memphis Commercial Appeal newspaper, however, depicted Darrow as the Antichrist, gazing down on a modern landscape of agnosticism, annihilation, and spiritual despair. After the judge refused to permit scientific evidence, William Jennings Bryan agreed to serve as an expert witness on the Bible. Bryan professed his belief in biblical miracles, but under a barrage of rationalistic queries by Darrow, Bryan conceded that he did not believe in the literal interpretation of the Bible. The once great political orator's admission seemed pathetic to both his detractors and fundamentalist followers. Bryan's befuddled testimony and Darrow's withering cross-examination delighted freethinkers and filled 6 columns in The Truth Seeker.
William Jennings Bryan cried, "I am more interested in the Rock of Ages than in the Age of Rocks." It was his last fight. He won the trial and died a few days later.
John Scopes was convicted and fined $100. Many believed that the Scopes trial would prove Charles Darwin's theory of evolution once and for all.
It didn't reverse the tide of opinion in the country, but it set the stage for a series of Supreme Court cases that would begin to protect free speech in a legal way, which was more than the ACLU could ever have hoped for at the time because of the generally conservative nature of the courts.
It didn't settle the issue, and in fact, the Supreme Court didn't take up the question of teaching evolution in the public schools for another 40 years.
It was a really important propaganda victory, at least, for advocates of free speech. Of course, we didn't win the struggle for John Scopes, who lost the battle, and ultimately his case got thrown out. But it alerted people to the fact that there was a conflict over ideas in the country, and that it was important to protect ideas, even ideas that you might disagree with.
One freethinker who knew the importance of protecting ideas and made a fortune publishing them was Emanuel Haldeman Julius. After World War I, Haldeman Julius transformed a socialist publishing house in Girard, Kansas, into a publishing phenomenon. Like D.M. Bennett, Haldeman Julius was inspired by Thomas Paine's Age of Reason.
He was basically the most influential freethought publisher of the early 20th century. Haldeman Julius rolled out a line of what he called little blue books, and these were small pamphlets, a size that would fit in a workman's shirt pocket. Might be a passage from Shakespeare or an argument from Voltaire, a speech of Ingersoll. He also published titles on sex education, pretty wide-ranging, and became a sensation. Haldeman Julius basically invented paperback publishing and the direct mail industry.
Increasingly, after World War I, books began to deal with the subject of sex more openly, and American authors were dealing with sex in a realistic way in fiction, in a way that was deeply disturbing to the guardians of moral decency.
In Boston, authorities prosecuted a number of bookstore owners for selling obscene books.
Over the course of a 3-year period ending in about 1929, the Boston authorities managed to kick out of their town some of the most classic works of American literature that we recognize today.
In 1926, a year after he reported the Scopes trial, H.L. Mencken traveled to Boston to cover his own prosecution. The Boston police had arrested a newsstand dealer for selling an issue of Mencken's magazine.
Wasn't sexually explicit in any way, but the defenders of decency in Boston considered it obscene because it had to do with sex, and that was good enough for them. He went and successfully defended his magazine in court. It was an extremely important turning point for the American publishing industry, which up until then had not vigorously defended free speech, and booksellers often cooperated with the censors and removed books that they didn't approve, and in fact helped them select the books that should be removed. The librarians as well. These groups began to realize that they had a responsibility to fight for these books. And ultimately, they overcame the resistance in Boston. They changed one of the country's broadest obscenity laws so that literature wouldn't fall under the knife, and we've been fighting ever since.
Since the founding of the nation, religionists have claimed that America's founding fathers and presidents were all devout Christians.
There are a number of paintings of Washington kneeling and praying at Valley Forge. Has no basis in truth. Washington was a deist. He wasn't likely to do anything like that. But I think there's a need to believe that these important figures, including the founding fathers and someone like Lincoln, were conventional believers.
In 1928, Christians tried to canonize George Washington based on a story and an artist's imagination. After the post office issued a George Washington stamp, Truth Seeker editor George MacDonald declared it a perversion of truth that belonged with the fabled nonsense of the cherry tree and the hatchet. If postal authorities were bent on issuing a religious stamp, however, George MacDonald suggested something historically accurate, a stamp showing Catholic Governor Al Smith on his knees, bowing and kissing the ring of an emissary of the Church of Rome in the name of the American people. In 1928, Cecil B. DeMille, who twice brought the 10 Commandments to American theaters, directed The Godless Girl. The film was based on the life of a remarkable young California freethought evangelist, Queen Silver, and atheist activist Charles Smith.
DeMille used that example to create this fantastic woman character who was basically organizing America's high schools for atheism. In creating this story, DeMille was conflating Queen Silver, this charismatic young woman, Freethought preacher, more or less, also with some of the activism of Charles Lee Smith, who had created the American Association for the Advancement of Atheism in the early 1920s. He was a militant atheist. He got to start selling the Truth Seeker on the streets of New York. He became nationally prominent when he went to Little Rock, opened a anti-religious, pro-evolution bookstore, and was arrested for blasphemy. He was never fully prosecuted, but he was the last American to serve jail time in connection with a blasphemy charge. And he eventually became the editor and publisher of The Truth Seeker. Freethinkers had been very concerned that DeMille would deliver some death blow to atheism. But The Godless Girl turned out to be a very different kind of movie.
The Godless Girl was one of DeMille's least successful films.
The Godless Girl was not that much of a polemic against atheism. This female lead wound up coming off as a rather heroic figure. But secondly, no one paid a great deal of attention to the film because it was 1929 and the talkies were coming in.
Oh, America didn't need repeal, she needed repentance. She didn't need wrong, she needed righteousness. We don't need JAGs, we need Jesus. We don't need more.
What Americans were paying attention to was radio. Similar to the invention of the steam press a century earlier, radio was seemingly heaven sent for Christian evangelizing. Protestant preachers and Catholic priests took to the airwaves, reaching into living rooms far and wide. This new communication medium, however, was financed by advertisers. Soap manufacturers saw more profit in promoting the proverb, "Cleanliness is next to godliness," than spending their advertising dollars on attacks on the Bible. Even on the lecture circuit, breathless preaching crowded out free thought. By the 1920s, the old guard of liberal lecturers had died out, and the speakers' platforms had become stages for more entertaining presentations by evangelists. One of the most prominent evangelists of this period was Billy Sunday.
Society rests on morals. Morals rest on religion. Religion rests on the Bible and faith in God and Jesus Christ. The Bible doesn't condemn any man because of himself. The Bible says the man that don't provide for his family is worse than an infant.
He didn't believe in evolution. He didn't believe we were descended from monkeys, and he advertised his distaste for the evolutionists by seeming to throw up on stage on occasion. I'm sure he did many more colorful things, but that's one of the ones that we remember.
America needs a tidal wave of the old-time religion. America needs to be taken down to God's bathhouse and the hose to turn on her. And the time isn't far distant when the wheels of God's judgment are going to go through this old God-hating world. And I want to take a pledge in this audience to join me in a pledge that you will never rest until this old God-hating, Christ-hating, whiskey-soaked, Sabbath-breaking, blaspheming, infidel, bootlegging old world is bound to the cross of Jesus Christ by the golden chains of love.
The influential evangelist, who visited the White House and dined with wealthy industrialists, politicians, and presidents, also didn't believe in writing his own speeches. Billy Sunday, along with another preacher, was exposed as a hypocrite for using the words of a man whom he despised and whose lecture tours he publicly protested, Robert Ingersoll. By the late 1920s, the Truth Seeker was no longer self-supporting, and George MacDonald depended on donations to continue publishing. The stock market crash in 1929 and the subsequent economic collapse forced the editor to curtail production. The weekly became a monthly in 1930. After burning bright for more than a century of vibrant opposition, the American Freethought movement was flickering out. By the 1930s, only scattered embers remained. With the exception of a few years, when he and Samuel Porter Putnam published their own periodical, George MacDonald had been with the Truth Seeker since 1875. In 1937, George MacDonald reluctantly turned the Truth Seeker over to his assistant editor Charles Smith, but continued as editor emeritus until his death at the age of 87 in 1944. In the American Freethought movement, George MacDonald played a meritorious role. MacDonald chronicled the history of the Truth Seeker and the achievements of the men and women, the Freethinkers, who Clarence Darrow declared made it safe to think. Although George MacDonald was called the grand old man of free thought, he did not describe himself as an atheist, but never denied the accusation. "That means without God," he said. "Why should I say I am without God any more than I would say I am without a devil, a spook, or without whatever you can think of?"
I hope that what people will bring away from this series is a new recognition of the role that free thought has played in American life.
There's an assumption that what we have, we've always had and always will have, and that's kind of a dangerous assumption. What we have gained in free speech in this country in the 20th century was something that was fought for.
There are some very significant people and movements and literary works that are not appreciated, that need to be appreciated. I think most of all, people need a much better understanding of how these events in the turbulent years of the Gilded Age helped to shape 20th and 21st century America.
Americans know that we have a lot of free speech in this country, and they're not particularly curious about how we got it. We live in a society with many different conflicts, and people are always, as a result of those, calling for the suppression of the views of those that they disagree with. So this is not a problem that will ever go away.
There's a great deal about what has made America what it is today that's very difficult to understand if you don't understand the role that the freethinkers played.
Freethinkers viewed history as a continuous struggle between religion and rationalism, the forces of darkness and light. And while religious fanaticism still exists, freethinkers exposed religion as against reason and enlightened generations of Americans.